Hello, thanks for being in a new video. This time I have review of the Huawei MateBook D16 in its most basic configuration. Let's get started. A few days ago, I published the review of the Huawei MateBook D16, but in its highest configuration, with Intel Core i9 and 16 GB of RAM. But in this case, I also wanted to review the same computer, but in its most basic configuration, that is, with Intel Core i5 and 8 GB of RAM. Let's see what this computer is capable of in its most basic edition in the model of 2024. Its price, applying a discount code that Huawei is giving right now, at least at the time of recording this video, is 9,999 pesos. On screen, you see the reference price in dollars. I don't know how you feel about the price outside of Mexico, but inside Mexico, I must say that it is a very competitive price compared to what they can offer us. So, this will not be a fully detailed review because many of its features can be found in the video review of the highest unit model since they share issues such as design, ports, camera, software, obviously. So I invite you to get to know that computer, and simply in this video, let me tell you the differences. That, at the design level, mainly will be the keyboard, which is not backlit. That will be one of the main differences, but it's still a fairly large keyboard. It still includes the numeric keypad, which is key for students, especially in accounting and other sections where you tend to use numbers a lot. Here, it definitely comes well equipped in that regard. But it keeps a simple trackpad, it keeps a screen with an anti-glare finish, it keeps stereo sound but at the bottom so it's not an overly prominent sound, and it keeps the camera that only gives an HD signal, so for basic video calls it is fine. But in addition to not being a backlit keyboard, it also changes with respect to the battery. So in this case we have a slightly smaller battery compared to the top version. In this case the battery is 56 watt-hours, which for the price either way, it seems like a good battery to me. And I usually do two tests. The first is to run an application that drains the battery as fast as you can, putting the processor to work at maximum. So, this is simply a benchmark because in reality, to drain the battery that fast, you would have to be doing very heavy work or playing games constantly. And in that case, I managed to discharge it in approximately 1 hour and 25 minutes. I insist it's not that the battery is going to perform 1 hour and 25 minutes. This is an extreme test. So I also did another benchmark test, and simply playing YouTube videos in full HD with a screen level at 50 and also a sound level at 50, it reached 6 hours and 46 minutes, which honestly is a remarkable duration considering it's not a high-end computer. So the battery life is going to be pretty good. I think for working on documents or school stuff, it's going to do just fine without you having to carry the charger necessarily. But while we're talking about the charger, let me also tell you how fast it can charge, because again, we'll see a difference here. Being a smaller battery, it can vary the charging time compared to the top version. So in 15 minutes, it recovered 24% battery in the test that I did. In 30 minutes, it got up to 40%. And the full charge it finished in 1 hour and 48 minutes. I honestly don't think it excels much in fast charging or anything like that. But fortunately, it's a battery that lasts well. And also that at the software level, it comes with some other battery protection options that I'll tell you about in the full video review. But obviously, the main difference between this model and the top model will be performance. And before I go to show you some tests, let me tell you about the benchmarks results. Using Cinebench, which is one of the most widely used benchmarks, the scores were as follows. In multi-core, it reached 8,295 points, and in single-core, 1,636. These scores are with the computer plugged to the power with the maximum performance mode enabled. Remember that maximum performance can be enabled by pressing FN and the letter P, but obviously this is in the highest possible power setting. But when you unplug it from the power, a balanced power consumption mode is enabled, and in this case in multi-core it scored 7,888 points, and in single-core 1,156. Although these are simply benchmark numbers, and probably if you are not too fond of checking benchmarks, they are not telling you anything. So let's go test it with various applications and see how it does. Right now we have the balanced power consumption profile because it's not plugged into power, so let's test how long it takes by opening 10 apps. We are going to start the timer and we are going to open the applications one by one. We wait until they finish opening completely before opening the next app, and I honestly feel like it's behaving pretty well. We are going to continue with this process of opening applications, and we have now reached the heaviest applications such as Adobe Premiere Pro, and after this we are going to open Photoshop, which is another of the heavy applications. Obviously, these applications are where it's gonna take the longest, but I was honestly surprised at how fast it opened the simplest applications. It's a performance that I think is super good for this price point. I'm opening the last of the applications, which is Lightroom, which is also a fairly heavy application, and we'll see when they finish opening to calculate how long it takes on average. 4.5 seconds it took on average. In fact, it is very curious because it seems then that it goes much faster than the top model, which took 5 seconds on average while unplugged with the Intel Core i9. So it seems that with the computer unplugged from the power, this processor behaves wonderfully. So I'm going to close all the applications again, and I'm going to plug the computer to repeat this test now with a maximum performance profile. As I already anticipated, you can activate the maximum performance with the key combination FN plus P. Then with this profile, we will see how long it takes to repeat exactly the same test. Notice that these applications open very quickly and it takes longer with complex applications. But let's see. It has already started to open Adobe Premiere Pro, and after this, we are going to open Photoshop. I think it's taking a very similar amount of time to what we saw unplugged, but either way we're going to wait for the whole application to load completely before we draw our conclusions. It seems to be going a little faster and it's about to finish this test. We're just about there, and that's it. It's definitely a very similar time, 3.3 seconds on average. So in a way we can say that it gets to have very similar performance plugged in and unplugged, which not all laptops on the market can boast. So I like what we're seeing in terms of performance. Although obviously in this case there is a noticeable difference from the top model, which took 2.8 seconds on average when we had it plugged into the power. But honestly, there's not much difference in these basic tasks. Now notice that the RAM is practically full at this point, that we have several things open. So let's push it to the limit to see how it's still performing. For example, we're going to apply some photo editing options here. Let's go to Photoshop and let's also open a photograph, because in this case only the application was open but no photograph. So I already have a photograph loaded. I'm also going to load the object selection to see more or less how long it takes. And notice that it's a little bit slow at this point because it's working on trying to detect the objects in the photograph. It is in this case when we start to see that the computer is not a top-of-the-range computer. It's now reacting to the objects, as you can see, but it still feels sluggish, and in fact at this point it's frozen. Let's wait for it to react. These types of tasks are obviously going to require more power, but if you're not going to be editing photos at this level, you're going to feel good performance. Also, obviously, if you're going to be doing these kinds of tasks, you're going to want to close other applications because it's got 8 GB of RAM, so it's not too much. And look, it finally reacted, although it didn't take a minute to finally recognize all the objects in this Smart Edition. So we have this picture open, and let's check that the RAM has gone down a little bit, probably closed some browser tabs or something similar. Let's now open a project in Adobe Premiere, and we already have this project. It's an extremely simple project, but it's using RAM anyway. And notice how the computer can get a little bit clunky when you're loading this kind of project. Obviously because the RAM memory is already a little short. So, it is not recommended that you open so many things at the same time because the computer does not have that much RAM to handle all these tasks at the same time. Finally, it seems to have finished loading everything it needs to load and is back to running smoothly. It took about 10 to 15 seconds, and we're going to keep switching applications for you to see if all of them are still running. And it looks like they are. As you can see, Adobe Premiere is still running fine. Photoshop, let's go again to object selection and it's still working fine. Let's go now to Lightroom and it's still running fine, and that's 3 fairly complex applications, but they're all still running, and obviously the simpler applications are going to run without any problems. Let's open up some PowerPoint presentations to see how it's doing. Right now it's downloading from the cloud, this document. Let's open another presentation to see how it's doing and see how this presentation is already loaded perfectly. It loads without any problems whatsoever. In this sense, the experience is going to be exaggeratedly smooth. It has no problems. Let's go to open the other presentation and see. Everything is still perfectly fine. Let's go to Excel now, and I'm going to open a simple document that has some charts and this kind of thing, and again we see a good experience here. In fact, I'm going to open an Excel document with a lot more records to see if I can complicate your life. Right now it's opening and this file has a lot more records in it, but it's done. In fact, it also has several filters applied, and look at how fast the computer performs. So in this regard, I don't think you're going to have any problems. Finally, let's go to Word and open a file as well, in this case with some graphics. It's downloading from the cloud, but finally it's already locally, and notice that it also gives us considerably good performance. Now I'm going to open a document that has many more sheets, and it notes that it also opened it very quickly. I don't see any performance issues with this computer. It definitely has very high performance. And finally, we are going to open several tabs of the web browser to see how it behaves with so many things open. Because at the moment I have practically 10 or 11 tabs open in the browser, and as you can see, it is still performing well. It is true that it has some stumbles when it is loading the content, but once it finishes loading the content, it goes much more smoothly. Look again, we continue to see good performance. Now let's go to Instagram, and it's still going well. We open TikTok and it's still behaving well. Let me maximize the window so it looks much better. Now we're on YouTube, and again we have some good content. Let's go to the next tab, which is Canva, and as you can see, everything is working pretty well. We now have Wikipedia, Amazon, everything is going very well. Let's go now to Mercado Libre, Microsoft, Google Translate, and everything is working well. As you notice, the switching between the different tabs also seems to be very fast, so I don't see any time when the computer is completely frozen. Let's go back to Lightroom, which is a complex application. Back to Premiere, and I'm surprised that it continues to maintain good performance. I actually think it's doing quite well. Let's remove the background of this image, for example, with Adobe Photoshop's Auto button. These types of complex tasks do take more time, as you can see. But overall, it is a computer that has maintained excellent performance. It finally finished showing us the result, and it has done quite well. Let's go to Premiere again, and I insist that the computer has managed to behave quite well. Honestly, that for this price, it is a super good performance that it has achieved. I don't have any complaints about it. So lastly, let's try exporting video so you can see roughly how long it takes to export a 4K video. For test, 1 minute duration. These are videos recorded in 4K. We're going to export them also in 4K with H.264. Also, the export will be in 4K. So let's see how it goes. 3, 2, 1, and let's start working. And that's it. It took 39 seconds. It did too well if you compare it to the top of the line model, which with an Intel Core i9 took 31 seconds. So that's basically 8 seconds difference. Obviously, this is a simple project. If you multiply that on a larger project, the difference is going to be much greater. But I've been surprised at how well this machine performs. In fact, I'm getting curious how long it would take with the computer unplugged. Let's do this process again and wait to see how long it takes in power balanced mode. And that's it. It was 44 seconds. Again, there is a small difference, but honestly, even unplugged from the power, I think it can still give you very good power. Lastly, I also ran some games. We started with Minecraft, and note that in the settings we obviously let it have unlimited frames per second to see what this computer was capable of. We played both unplugged and plugged in. So let's see what the result is. In this case, the result was very similar, giving us a considerably good experience. When you have a very close perspective with few objects, it is capable of reaching 60 frames per second, but the average was 35. However, it doesn't really drop off significantly. Obviously, this game is simple, but I think it can give you a good experience without generating too much heat yet, as I insist that it is a simple game. In fact, unplugged it reached 37.9 degrees Celsius, and plugged in it reached 39.4 degrees Celsius. In Asphalt 9, we set the graphics settings to the highest possible quality with all effects enabled, and in this case, when unplugged, it gave us good enough quality. Obviously, it's not a gamer's computer, but it averaged 30 frames per second, so it's smooth enough to have a good gaming experience. Obviously, it's not gonna give you ultra smooth graphics, but considering we enabled all the special effects, the performance was definitely good. It didn't drop below 24 frames per second, and the temperature on this top end was 42.5 degrees Celsius unplugged. And when we plugged it into power, honestly, the performance was very similar. There wasn't too much difference, maybe a little bit more stability. In fact, there was a moment when it did go up to 41 frames per second, but I insist that it wasn't much of a difference. The average went up to 34 frames per second, that is, plugged in it gave us 4 frames per second more on average, although obviously the temperature also rose a little more, reaching up to 44.3 degrees Celsius in this upper zone. But the fans do a very good job of cooling this processor. In Disney Speedstorm, this device noticed that it gives us just an automatic quality, so we ran it at that quality just to see how it did. And unplugged from the power, I feel like the performance was good, although obviously it doesn't have as many effects and as much detail because of the graphics quality that's not set to the highest. But if you're not too picky about the visuals, I think the result is very positive. In fact, it does have 60 frames per second on average. Truth be told, it did very well, even without getting too hot, although it's obviously not free of some cuts when you're playing. Especially if you are recording the screen, you may have some minor stumbles in the frames per second, but honestly they are very few. It's not something that will spoil your gaming experience. So, if you're into gaming, you simply have to have the right graphics quality for this computer and it's going to give you good performance. And in fact, if you plug it into the power, it's going to get even better. I mean, plugged into the power, the cuts in the frames per second are much less, so they're not as constant, and that makes your gaming experience completely fine. In this case, it got up to 44.5 degrees Celsius on this top end, which obviously on a computer doesn't get to be something annoying. And finally, we run Gears of War 4 and notice that by default, it loads these graphics settings. We have the frames per second unlimited, and various texture details and the like are set to low quality. Obviously, although there are some other things that are set to medium, this is the default setting, and you know, these computer games have too many settings. So we ran the game at this default quality, and honestly the experience is pretty good. If you have a smooth and comfortable experience when playing, obviously you are not going to have ultra detailed graphics, but if you are not demanding in that aspect, definitely the experience will be good. I think at this price point we couldn't ask for anything better, and it definitely performs well when you're gaming, even with the computer unplugged from the power, where it gave us 33 frames per second on its average, reaching a temperature of 44 degrees Celsius on this front end. And when you have the computer plugged into the power, even its average goes up to 45 frames per second, although the temperature also rose in a very important way, reaching 50.4 degrees Celsius. It was the test where we saw more heat, but it is normal being a game a little more complex, although obviously as I anticipated, the graphics quality was not very demanding, but simply confirms that you can get to have a good gaming experience if you select a suitable graphics quality. In summary, this computer seems to me to be very good for those who are looking for a very large screen computer to work with and want to have enough power to run everything with good speed. Obviously, it is not a computer aimed at the most demanding in video editing or gaming, because for that they are much more expensive computers. But the relationship that has this computer between its price and its performance has seemed to me extremely nice. I hope you liked this video. If so, you know you can tell us, and we'll see you next time.